Welcome, everybody, to a deep dive into mental strength.
Oh, I like that.
We're going to be dissecting Amy Morin's book, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do.
That's a good one.
It is a good one to uncover, those habits that we might have that might be holding us back and to get some practical tips for cultivating resilience. Think of it as building up your toolkit for life's challenges, right? And what I find so interesting about Amy Morin is that her insights come from personal experience. She faced unimaginable loss, losing her mother suddenly, becoming a widow at 23.
Oh, wow.
And then losing her second husband.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So she's had to, yeah.
So she'd been through it, and I think that gives, her work a lot of weight.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, right, what is mental strength anyway? It's like, it's a buzzword these days.
It is a buzzword. It's funny when you hear the phrase, like, what picture comes up. It's almost like, someone who's kind of like unemotional or
stoic. Yeah, exactly.
like not showing any feelings.
Yeah. And I think in my work, with clients, I often hear, people say, well, I can't help how I feel.
Right.
So is mental strength really about just like toughening it out? I don't know.
It's more than just toughening it out. I mean, it's not about suppressing your emotions, but it is about learning how to regulate them.
Okay.
So kind of having that ability to manage your thoughts and your behaviors, even when circumstances are difficult.
Okay.
We all have some degree of mental strength. It's like a muscle,
Yeah.
The more you work it, the stronger it becomes.
I like that, a mental muscle.
Yeah.
So Morin lays out 13 things that mentally strong people don't do.
Uh-huh.
So I'm assuming we're not going to just go down a list, right?
We're not going to go down a list.
Okay, good.
But we are going to explore the themes that connect these habits and bring them to life a little bit with some of the examples from the book and then, maybe some other examples from the real world. So we can start with one that I think is pretty relatable for everybody, feeling sorry for ourselves.
Oh, I think we've all been there.
Uh-huh.
And Morin tells the story about young Jack who gets hit by a bus.
Right.
Which is a traumatic experience.
Right.
But it was his parents' constant pity that really dragged him down, wasn't it?
So, it was one thing that he got hit by the bus, which of course is awful. But then the way that the parents responded, they really focused on, the things that he could no longer do, which really just fostered the sense of helplessness.
Okay.
And, it speaks to, I think, the real trap of self-pity. It's kind of like quicksand, the more you wallow in it,
Oh, yeah.
the deeper you sink, the harder it is to get out. And, not only does it consume so much of your time and your energy, but it really fuels that negativity and it makes you less likely to want to take action to improve things.
Yeah. And Morin even shares her own experience with this concept. And she talks about, choosing action over wallowing. And she goes skydiving on her late husband's birthday.
Wow.
Which I just think is so
Powerful.
powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I can't even imagine.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to this idea of locus of control.
Right.
Like, we may not have control over every event, right? That's the external locus of control.
Right.
But we do have a choice in how we respond, and that's where the internal comes in.
Exactly. So you're right. Like, we're not always in control of what happens to us. That's life, But we are in control of how we react and how we choose to respond. And I think, dwelling in the misfortune, it keeps you kind of stuck in that external space.
Right.
But when you take action, even if they're small steps,
Right.
that starts to shift you more to that internal locus of control.
Yeah, yeah.
And you feel a sense of agency.
That's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of so many clients who I've had that have felt trapped, by past mistakes or circumstances. And Morin talks about how mentally strong people don't give away their power.
Yes.
And she uses the example of Lauren and her overbearing mother-in-law, which I think is a classic example of blurred boundaries.
Yes. Very, very classic. In this case, Lauren, she's constantly letting her mother-in-law dictate her mood. Like her mother-in-law would say something and it would just completely like derail her whole day.
Oh, I've been there.
And, it even affected like her parenting decisions.
Wow.
So this lack of boundaries, it's essentially like giving someone else the remote control to your emotional state, which is exhausting.
Yeah. It's like you're constantly, and then you end up feeling resentful.
Exactly. And I think it kind of reminds me of the concept of learned helplessness.
Oh, interesting.
So, where you have repeated negative experiences and it kind of leads you to believe that you have no control over the situation, even if you do.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then speaking of reclaiming power, Morin talks about Officer Stephen McDonald,
Okay.
who was paralyzed in the line of duty.
Wow.
And he actually chose to forgive his shooter.
Wow. Now that's a powerful example of choosing not to be defined by someone else's actions.
Right. And, it's not about condoning what happened,
Right.
but it's about making that conscious choice to respond in a way that doesn't let that event control your entire life.
It reminds me of that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
That's such a good one.
Yeah, it is. I think that really captures like the power of forgiveness.
Yeah,
It can really be liberating.
it is.
And that leads us to another really important aspect of mental strength, which is embracing change.
Yes.
And I'm curious about this because hasn't there been research showing that like the human brain is actually kind of wired to resist change?
Yeah.
Right? And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Like, back in the day, change could mean danger.
Sure. But these days, it doesn't always serve us, does it?
It doesn't always serve us. And, Morin argues that, sometimes resisting change can actually be more detrimental than the change itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, she has an example of this guy, Andrew, who is stuck in this soul-crushing job.
Oh, I've met a lot of Andrews.
Right. And, he's miserable, but he's terrified of the unknown. He's terrified of what might happen if he actually leaves this job.
I know so many people like that.
Right. And the irony is, by staying stuck, he's actually, choosing a different kind of negative consequence.
Yeah.
So he's missing out on potential growth, new opportunities.
The problems often fester. They get bigger.
Exactly. They just keep getting bigger.
Yeah.
And so she really encourages people to examine the different types of change that we encounter, whether it's unplanned, anticipated, self-initiated, and then really think about, the cost-benefit analysis of staying stuck versus, embracing that unknown. And a lot of times it is that fear. Fear is at the root of that resistance. But what if, instead of thinking about it as fear, what if we reframed it as excitement?
Oh, I like that.
For what could be.
Yeah, excitement for the possibilities.
Exactly.
That's a really good point. Now, what about when change is feels completely out of our control, which happens a lot? Morin uses the story of James, who's embroiled in a custody battle, to illustrate this danger of focusing on the things that we can't control.
Yeah.
And he's spending all this energy trying to, influence the judge's decision or his ex-wife's actions. It's got to be exhausting.
Right. It's completely exhausting and goes back to that locus of control.
Yes.
But it also highlights, I think, self-efficacy. So it's that belief in your own ability to influence outcomes.
Okay.
And so when you're hyper-focused on the things that you can't control, it diminishes your sense of agency, and it kind of feeds into that learned helplessness.
Right, right. That makes me think of how much time people waste worrying about things like the weather.
Oh, yeah.
Or traffic.
Totally.
Or what other people think of them.
Yes. All things that are outside of your control.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't control any of that.
Nope.
And so it's about finding that balance, acknowledging what you can influence, but then also accepting what you can't.
Right.
And so she calls this the bi-locus of control, where you're kind of embracing both.
I like that.
Yeah, and that's a really key ingredient in mental strength.
That's a really good point. Now let's, should we shift gears a little bit?
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm ready for the next mental strength challenge.
Let's talk about people-pleasing.
Ooh, yeah.
I think that's something, a lot of us can relate to, especially in today's world.
Oh, for sure.
Um,
It's so true. And I've definitely fallen into that trap myself. You want to be liked, you want to be helpful, but where do you draw the line? And Morin talks about how, mentally strong people don't try to please everyone.
Yes, and she uses the example of Megan, who is the ultimate people pleaser.
Okay.
She is constantly exhausted, spreading herself thin, trying to meet everyone's needs except her own.
Right.
And I think that resonates with so many people, especially, now with the added pressure of social media.
It's like we're all performing on a digital stage.
Yes.
Right. Trying to, project this image of perfection and likability.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
It's exhausting.
It's no wonder that people-pleasing is such a struggle.
Yeah.
And one thing that she suggests is, really asking yourself the question, whose happiness am I prioritizing right now?
Well, it's a good question.
Yeah, it kind of forces you to confront your motives. And are you, putting other people's needs before your own all the time?
Right. And what's the long-term consequence of that? Yeah. I remember working with a client who was a chronic people pleaser, and she was so afraid of conflict and disappointing others
Oh, yeah.
that she ended up just feeling resentful and completely depleted.
Yeah, it's not sustainable.
No, and it took a lot of work. But we started by really kind of exploring her why.
Right.
Like, what was driving this need to please everyone?
That's a great approach because I think understanding the root of the behavior is so important because it could be, a fear of conflict. It could be learned behavior from childhood. It could even be, a desire to feel needed. Like you're validating yourself through, other people's approval.
Right.
But the key is to, recognize that that pattern is not sustainable and that it often comes at the expense of your own well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not about, becoming selfish
Right.
or inconsiderate,
Right.
but it's about finding that healthy balance.
Exactly.
Right, between honoring your own needs and being there for others.
Yeah, like they say on the airplane, put on your own oxygen mask first before assisting others.
Exactly, yeah. Now, Morin also talks about taking calculated risks.
Mm.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this because, risk-taking can feel daunting,
It can be very daunting.
especially if you've had setbacks in the past.
Yeah.
Right.
And she acknowledges that, fear often plays a major role in our risk assessment.
Of course.
She talks about this guy, Dale, who wants to open a furniture business,
Okay.
but he's paralyzed by a past financial failure,
Oh, yeah.
which is totally understandable.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to make the distinction between reckless risks and calculated risks.
I like that. Yeah.
It's not about, throwing caution to the wind,
Right.
but it's about weighing the costs and benefits,
weighing.
gathering information, making informed decisions. And sometimes it's about challenging those limiting beliefs that are keeping you playing small.
I love that. I love that distinction.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're just playing it too safe.
Yeah.
Right.
And, think about Othmar Ammann, who switched careers at 60 to become a world-renowned bridge designer.
Wow.
I mean, if he had let fear dictate his choices, we wouldn't have those iconic bridges.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's
That's very inspiring.
inspiring.
Yeah, it makes you realize, maybe our comfort zone is actually really limiting.
It is. It's very limiting.
Yeah.
And that pushing past those boundaries can lead to incredible things.
Yeah, but what about the past?
Right.
Right. How do we learn from it without, letting it hold us hostage? Morin says mentally strong people don't dwell on the past.
Yes.
So elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. So they acknowledge it, they learn from it, but they don't let it define their present or their future.
Okay.
And she tells the story of Gloria, whose 28-year-old daughter keeps moving back home after failed relationships.
Oh, wow.
And Gloria blames herself, and she's kind of trapped in this cycle of guilt and shame over, her perceived parenting mistakes.
Yeah, I've seen that dynamic play out so many times in families.
Oh, yeah.
It's really heartbreaking.
It is.
And it speaks to how easily we can fall into that trap of, what's the word? Rumination.
Yes.
Right.
Rumination.
Like replaying past events over and over again.
Yeah, and Morin points out, this dwelling on the past, it's not just unproductive.
Yeah.
It's actually bad for your mental and your physical health.
Really?
Yeah, studies have shown it can actually increase your stress levels,
Wow.
increase inflammation in your body,
Wow.
even put you at higher risk for chronic diseases.
So it's not just about, feeling bad. It's actually bad for us.
It's actually bad for you.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like we're holding on to these emotional wounds and they never really get a chance to heal.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what's the alternative then? How do we make peace with the past without just sweeping it under the rug?
Morin suggests a process of active reflection
Okay.
and reframing. So it's about acknowledging what happened, accepting that you can't change it,
Right.
but then choosing how you're going to let it affect you in the present.
Right.
It reminds me of the concept of post-traumatic growth.
Oh, interesting.
So this idea that you can actually find meaning and growth in the aftermath of challenging experiences.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
It's like you're turning those wounds into wisdom.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And speaking of learning and growing,
Mm-hmm.
Morin also highlights the importance of not repeating the same mistakes.
Yes.
Right. And she tells the story of Christy, who struggles with yelling at her kids,
Oh, yeah.
which, so many parents can relate to,
Right.
right?
It's so relatable.
But, she knows it's not effective.
Yeah.
But she still does it.
Right. And it highlights how we can get stuck in these negative patterns,
Yeah.
even when we know better.
Yeah.
And she suggests that, these repeated mistakes often happen because of a lack of self-awareness,
Okay.
a fear of discomfort,
Okay.
or simply not having a plan for doing things differently,
Yeah.
you know?
It's like we're on autopilot.
Totally, yeah.
We're just reacting habitually instead of responding consciously.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like that saying, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten.
Right, exactly. So it takes, a conscious effort to break those patterns.
Okay.
And, think about Roland Macy. He founded Macy's department store.
Okay, yeah.
He actually experienced multiple business failures before he found success.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so each setback, provided a valuable lesson for him and ultimately contributed to, his eventual triumph.
I find that so encouraging. It's like setbacks are inevitable. That's what we do with them.
It's how you respond. It's what you learn from it.
Exactly. Yeah. But what about when we see other people succeeding? I mean, it can be tough not to feel a little bit of envy or resentment.
It's human nature.
Right. Especially in a culture that often celebrates individual achievement.
Right. And comparison.
And comparison, yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard not to compare ourselves.
Totally. And, Morin says that mentally strong people don't resent other people's success.
Okay.
But she acknowledges that it's a common human experience.
Right.
She uses the example of Dan, the secretly resentful coworker.
Oh, yeah.
He's pretending to be happy for his colleague's promotion.
Right, right.
But secretly, he's seething with envy.
Oh, Dan, we've all met a Dan.
We've all met a Dan. Or been a Dan.
Or been a Dan, yeah, exactly. It's that feeling of comparison, right? It's that voice that says, why them and not me?
Uh-huh.
Or, it's not fair.
Yeah, exactly. But what's the cost of holding on to that resentment?
Yeah.
You
It's a heavy burden to carry.
It's a heavy burden, and it distracts you from your own goals. It breeds discontent. It can damage your relationships. It's a form of self-sabotage, really.
Yeah.
And, Morin challenges us to examine, our own definition of success.
Okay.
And to focus on our unique journey rather than getting caught in that comparison trap.
Right. Because I think when we do that,
Yeah.
it shifts our perspective from scarcity to abundance.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Like there's enough success to go around.
Yeah.
We don't have to, compete for it.
Right.
Now, speaking of success, how do we stay motivated when our efforts don't seem to be paying off quickly enough? Because I think Morin's final few points really kind of dig into this, don't they?
They do. And you're right. We live in this world that's all about instant gratification.
Yes.
But, personal growth just doesn't work that way.
Right.
It's a process that unfolds over time, and it requires patience, perseverance, and a willingness to kind of embrace that long game.
I'm all ears. Let's dive into these last few insights. So much of what we've been talking about seemed to come back to patience, right? And realistic expectations.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, what stood out to you in particular about Morin's final points.
The one that really struck me was this idea that mentally strong people don't fear alone time, which seems so counterintuitive, especially in our, hyper-connected world. But she makes this really compelling case for solitude as being a really crucial ingredient for mental strength. And she uses the example of Vanessa, who's just completely overwhelmed by her busy life. She's having trouble sleeping. Her mind's constantly racing.
Oh.
She's always on the go, seeking stimulation, but it's ultimately backfiring.
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I used to think that, being busy meant being productive. And I wore that busyness like a badge of honor.
Oh, yeah.
And it took me a while to realize I was actually avoiding stillness.
Right.
Right. Avoiding being alone with my own thoughts.
Yeah.
And honestly, those initial attempts at meditation felt so awkward.
Oh, yeah.
It's
so common.
Am I doing this right? Why is my brain so noisy?
Right. Because we're so used to constant stimulation. So the idea of just being still can feel very radical.
Yeah.
But she makes this really good distinction between loneliness, which is that feeling of isolation and disconnection, versus solitude, which is about consciously choosing to be alone with your thoughts.
Okay.
So it's about creating that space for reflection, processing your emotions, and just allowing your mind to rest and recharge.
Yeah. Yeah. Like hitting the reset button.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can see how this ties into mental strength.
Uh-huh.
Because when you're constantly bombarded,
Right.
right, with information, with stimulation, it's hard to develop that inner sense of calm and clarity, I think.
Totally. And she suggests like incorporating small doses of solitude into your everyday routine.
Okay.
Like taking a walk without your phone.
Right.
Turning off the TV when you're not actively watching it. Or even just, sitting in silence for a few minutes. It can make a big difference. And then, of course, there are the, more formal practices like meditation and mindfulness.
Right.
Which have been shown to have tons of benefits.
Speaking of mindfulness, Morin's example of Sarah's house really resonated with me. And it's such a great example of someone choosing to focus on giving rather than taking, even in the face of these incredible personal challenges.
Right.
So for those who don't know, Sarah was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And during her treatment, she was so struck by how far some patients had to travel. And, many were sleeping in their cars because they couldn't afford hotels.
It's heartbreaking.
And instead of, succumbing to despair or self-pity, Sarah decides to create a hospitality house.
Yes.
For cancer patients and their families.
Amazing.
And she just poured all of her energy into this project, even as she was battling her own illness.
Right.
It's so inspiring. It's like, we always have a choice.
Yeah.
In how we respond to adversity. And Sarah's story ties into, Morin's point about mentally strong people don't feel like the world owes them anything.
Right.
They take responsibility for their own lives, and they focus on what they can contribute.
It's a good antidote to entitlement,
Yes.
which is another one of her points.
Yes.
And we see this play out with the character of Lucas, the entitled new employee who expects a promotion right away without putting in the work.
Oh, Lucas.
Classic
Lucas. I think we've all encountered a Lucas.
I think we all have.
Yeah. It's like that sense of self-importance and a lack of empathy, right?
Yeah, total lack of empathy.
It makes me wonder, do you think that this sense of entitlement is becoming more prevalent, like in our culture?
Ooh, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
She does suggest it might be on the rise, especially, among younger generations.
Okay.
And she points to, some research indicating kind of these trends toward materialism and a decreased willingness to work hard. But I think regardless of the generational trends, the key is to recognize the dangers of entitlement.
Right.
Because it prevents you from taking responsibility for your own life.
Totally.
And it just sets you up for like constant disappointment.
Yeah. Resentment.
Yeah. And resentment. Yeah.
It's like, that saying, entitlement is a mask for insecurity.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. Like we're using it to protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable.
Right.
Or inadequate, but it's holding us back.
It is.
It's a form of self-sabotage, really.
It is, yeah. And she really emphasizes the importance of self-awareness.
Yeah.
In combating entitlement. So it's about catching yourself when you have those I deserve this or it's not fair thoughts and choosing a more empowering perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about, focusing on what we can control.
Yes.
Right? Our efforts, our attitude, our choices.
Yeah.
Rather than expecting this external validation or special treatment.
Yes, 100%.
And speaking of control, Morin's final point about not expecting immediate results really speaks to the importance of patience, doesn't it?
It does. And you're right. Like, we live in a world that is, so obsessed with instant gratification.
Yeah.
But real change, whether it's personal growth, whether it's, building a business or learning a new skill, it takes time. It takes consistent effort.
Right.
She even uses the example of Rudy Ruediger.
Wait, Rudy, as in the movie?
Yes.
Rudy. Oh, I love that movie.
I know. Such a classic underdog story.
Yes.
And, for years, he was held up as a symbol of perseverance, right? Defying the odds. But she uses his story to illustrate a more nuanced point because, later in life, Rudy actually got caught up in a get-rich-quick scheme.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
And ended up being charged with securities fraud.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So it's a reminder that even those who we see as, embodying these virtues can still stumble, can still make mistakes.
Yeah. It's a constant cultivation.
Exactly.
Right. It's not a one and done deal.
Not at all. It's a journey. It's an ongoing process.
Okay. So for those of us who, struggle with patience, what are some of the practical strategies that Morin offers?
Well, first of all, she says, keep your eyes on the prize.
Okay.
So remember why you're doing this.
Right.
And what you hope to achieve.
Yeah.
Break down those big goals into smaller, more manageable steps.
Right.
So you can celebrate those milestones along the way.
Yeah. It's like that saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Exactly, yeah. It's about taking consistent action, even when you don't see the results right away.
Right.
Don't be afraid to ask for support. Surround yourself with people who believe in you and who can offer that encouragement. And also, develop some healthy coping mechanisms
Okay.
for when those moments of frustration or self-doubt creep in. So whether it's exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, talking to a supportive friend,
Right.
all of those things can make a huge difference.
Yeah. It's about having a toolbox, right?
Mm.
Of strategies to help you navigate
Exactly, yeah.
those challenging moments.
Yeah. And lastly, focus on progress, not perfection.
Ah,
So, embrace that journey, knowing that setbacks are inevitable, but they don't define you. It's about celebrating those small wins, learning from your mistakes.
so as we wrap up this deep dive, what stands out to you most?
I think that recurring theme of control,
Yes.
or rather recognizing what we can and can't control,
Yes.
I think that is really like the foundation for building mental resilience.
It is.
We can't always control the circumstances we face,
Right.
but we can control our responses.
Right.
We can control our thoughts, our behaviors.
Yeah, and that's where the mental strength comes in.
Exactly.
It's about developing those inner resources to help us navigate challenges with grace,
Yeah.
with resilience, even when things get tough.
Even when things get tough.
So as we conclude, I would just encourage you to consider one small change you can make this week.
Yes.
Inspired by what we've talked about. Maybe it's setting a boundary, incorporating, 5 minutes of solitude into your day,
Right.
or even just noticing and reframing a negative thought.
Small steps lead to big changes. Remember, mental strength is like any muscle. The more you work it, the stronger it becomes.
It does. You are stronger than you think.
Yeah, you are.
Until next time, deep divers.